EdTech Live is sponsored by K12Computers.com, where you can save up to 50% on factory refurbished Dell Optiplex computers, and by TechnologyRescue.com, helping schools reuse existing computer hardware to build state-of-the-art Linux thin client labs at a fraction of the cost of traditional computing.
Welcome to EdTech Live. This is Steve Hargadon, and today is Thursday, October 5th. My guest tonight is Ragavan Srinivasan from Hewlett-Packard, and the topic is an introduction to open source licensing. Welcome, Ragavan.
Thanks, Steve.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then your current role at HP?
Sure. So my name is Ragavan Srinivasan, and basically right now I work for HP in the Open Source Program Office. So the Open Source Program Office is actually a pan-HP team that works on various aspects of open source software as it relates to the company. So for example, our team runs an open source review process that looks at any open source usage in the various HP products that we ship to our customers. It also helps advise any HP employee that wants to contribute to open source projects, etc. Another aspect that the Open Source Program Office does is actually maintain two key information portals. That is an internal open source portal for all HP employees to go and find out information about various aspects of open source within the company. And our team also maintains an external facing portal. So if you go to opensource.hp.com, which you'll see in the flash presentation that's hosted on the website, you can actually see all of HP's involvement in various open source projects and communities. So our team is responsible for maintaining those as well. So in general, what our team does is it works on a variety of tools and processes that basically help HP effectively use and contribute to open source software.
And do you have a background yourself in open source software? When did you become introduced to open source software?
So, me personally, I've probably been using open source for about 8 to 9 years. My first introduction was when I was in my undergrad school, and we helped set up one of the first Linux installations within our undergrad school at that point. When I started at HP, I was in a team that was working on introducing Jabber within the company. So I set up probably the first Jabber server within HP. And soon it became a huge success. And now HP has an enterprise-wide installation of Jabber with more than 80,000 employees using it, about 40 to 50,000 concurrent users. So I was a member of the Jabber Software Foundation for a brief period, but a lot of my work with open source has been towards helping HP internally use and contribute it.
How much is open source? How much is the perception of open source changing in companies like HP that are tier one computing providers? It's actually changed a lot. So maybe one of the things I can start is actually go through this presentation, and then as a result of this, you'll probably hear some examples of how HP is using open source, and that'll probably give you a better idea as I go through these slides. So why don't I just go on and move to slide number 2, actually slide number 3, and what I wanted to do is to start things off. I thought it would be a good idea to provide some basic context as to what one means when they say floss. So let me take a step back. This is the first time I'm using that term, floss, which basically stands for free, libre, open source software. And what I did was I actually put this question, what does floss mean to you, to some of my friends and colleagues and coworkers, just to get a sense for, what I hear back from them. And it was really amazing to hear some of the answers. So, of course, one of the most common answers I got from them, a lot of the non-technical friends and even some of the technical ones who thought they were being funny, was floss means dental hygiene. But we're not here today to talk about that. So if there's anyone that's tuned in to hear the latest and greatest in the world of dental hygiene, you've been warned. But on a more serious note, let's take a look at some of the other answers on the list. One of the answers I got was freedom. Now, this was actually pretty common from people that were really familiar with the Free Software Foundation, or the FSF, Richard Stallman, and their philosophy of free software. The free here referring to the freedom or liberty as opposed to price. What I would actually recommend, instead of going into all the details, is for anyone that's interested in the philosophical background of free software, is to actually visit the FSF.org website. They have an excellent article that introduces people to what they mean by free software. Another answer that I've heard is free as in beer. In this case, it's more of a practical, as in it's all about the price and there is nothing philosophical about it type of answer. Linux licenses, GPL, or the new general public licenses, these are all some of the other answers I've heard. One answer, which was kind of surprising that I actually heard, was someone said Microsoft. Now, the reason that person said Microsoft was because to him, FLOSS was basically just a bunch of code being written by a bunch of people that didn't like Microsoft or Bill Gates. Now, I'm not arguing that there is, probably some of that going around, but to characterize the entire FLOSS community as basically the quote-unquote anti-Microsoft, to me, is doing the FLOSS community a huge disservice. So that's why if you actually move to slide 4 of this presentation, what I've tried to do is attempted to describe some of the key characteristics of the FLOSS paradigm so that people do not attach a very simplistic view to what this means. So let's actually move to slide 4 of the presentation. And what you'll notice here is basically the core of what I think is behind the FLOSS paradigm. So there are 3 key pillars, if you will, that are all crucial to FLOSS, its functioning, and its success. The first pillar are the various licenses one can find in the free and open source community. The Open Source Initiative, their website is at opensource.org. Today tracks about 60 or so licenses, all of which fit their definition of open source. Their definition of open source has 10 to 12 salient characteristics, but the key ones being the software must be freely redistributable, the source code must be available, and you should have the ability to create derivative works. But anyway, the licenses, especially the reciprocal nature of some of these licenses, which are called copyleft licenses, if you will, the GPL probably being the most popular example, is a key reason why the FOSS community is thriving today. So without licenses like the GPL, one could actually argue that there is a risk that the open source community may be more like a BitTorrent network that has a whole bunch of leeches, but not really that many seeders, if you get the analogy. But there is a tendency to classify some of these copyleft licenses as viral licenses, which actually is not doing it justice, because these are not viral licenses. These are licenses that you choose and you agree to oblige by the terms and conditions that are set forth in the license. And these licenses are a key reason why the open source community and the free and open source community is what it is today. Copyrights in this case are still important. The Free Software Foundation, for example, requires that all software that comes from them is copyrighted by the Free Software Foundation. There are different reasons why people want to have ownership of the copyrights. In some cases, and in a lot of cases, the copyright holders may also choose to dual license or triple license their software. So the Free Software Foundation in this case wants to hold the copyright so that they can enforce what they call copyleft. Basically, copyleft is a mechanism by which they make sure that people that use the software that they get from the Free Software Foundation are also obligated when they redistribute the work to return the favor, so to speak, so that someone doesn't just go on taking the code instead of giving any contributions back. So the licenses, as I explained, are a really key piece of why open source software works and why it's so successful today. The other key reason, the second pillar, if you will, is the actual community itself. So the community, if you look at it, is basically this huge collection of developers, a lot of them with common interest. I mean, these are people that are across the world, that are collaborating across the world, across different languages, literally and otherwise. And they have a common drive to be able to work together as a community. And this is a key reason why the open source movement is what it is today. And we're increasingly seeing a large amount of funding from large companies like HP to some of the key projects that the open source community works on. The governments and academia, especially a lot of universities, are also contributing to this community at an increasing pace. The last, but by no means the least, pillar of the free and open source movement is the actual methodology itself. So if you take a step back and look at how the open source community works, it's a pretty communal, shared development methodology. Various projects each have their own subculture. The kernel group has their own subculture. The Debian project, the GNOME project, and the KDE, all of these have their own, subcultures. And it's really these cultures that actually drive those projects forward. And as you can expect, with all this diversity, there's also a huge amount of diversity in how these projects are governed. So, Debian and Apache probably have some of the most mature governance processes and governance models that are out there. GNOME is also another really well-governed project, but not all projects or communities have such strict or such formal governance methodologies. So, for a lot of enterprises that are looking to use open source software, this might present a bit of a challenge. One practical challenge that this throws is a lot of these projects don't have any roadmaps. And coming from a traditional, enterprise software development methodology, without having roadmaps, it makes it really hard to determine, okay, when am I going to release this? And if my commercial product depends on an open source project which does not have an established roadmap, then how am I going to set the expectations of my customers as to when my commercial product is going to be released? So these are some of the challenges that enterprises that are looking to use open source software are actually facing. But what I want to do is, again, go back and reiterate the fact that whenever people talk about free and open source software, I think it's really important that they consider these three key aspects and not just attempt to trivialize, if you will, as, open source, the whole free and open source movement is just, the anti-Microsoft, if you will. So I've actually talked about some of the theoretical aspects of this open source paradigm. On slide 5, what I've actually tried to do is provide some real-world examples of how within a company like HP, how open source software is being used and how we are seeing it being areas where we see it moving towards. So if you'll notice, a lot of the network edge and infrastructure machines on slide 4, like the directory servers, a lot of the security infrastructure, or file print infrastructures, web-based, email-based systems, a lot of these today are out-and-out implementations of open source software. It's totally penetrated. This is an area where open source software has been traditionally really mature. And if you take a look at Apache, if you take a look at OpenLDAP, these are all really good examples of core pieces of the infrastructure for any enterprise where open source software is so mature that it provides you the flexibility and the ability to use it within your enterprise. And we're doing that today within HP. Some of the other places where we are actually seeing open source software move is, if you will, up the stack. So a lot of our internal teams are using, for their middleware, like JBoss or Postgres, they're using a lot of open source software even higher up the stack than just the basic infrastructure. Recently, we've actually even noticed that there are emerging areas like a lot of laptops, thin clients, even handhelds, where free and open source software, Linux, are really being actively used. So what I want to convey with this slide is that if you take a look at an enterprise, right from the infrastructure through the middleware to an end user client, all of these have aspects of open source software being used. In the case of infrastructure, it's probably a lot more widely used as opposed to, say, higher up the stack or where it's still increasing. So free and open source software is not just someone's pet project anymore. There are several mission-critical pieces of infrastructure, even a company like HP, that rely on open source software, and this penetration is only increasing by the day. So I don't know if that answered the question that you had, but that's kind of my take on where I see open source software within the enterprise today. So are there any other questions, or do you want me to continue moving on to, say, the next part of the presentation?
Well, I think it probably would make some sense to ask a couple of questions.
Okay.
But I really am enjoying how you're going through the presentation, so I'll ask a couple of quick questions and then let you get back to that.
Sure.
So internally, knowing that most of the listeners to this program are going to be in educational organizations, what programs is HP using internally that they might be familiar with? And then, are you seeing anybody in HP using Moodle?
Moodle is probably not something that I've seen a lot of people use, but I'll give you another example, DSpace, which is a digital library program. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I'm personally not. But
it's basically a digital library implementation. Actually, this was something that came from HP Labs that we open sourced, and I believe MIT's open courseware site is actually pretty is a big heavy user of DSpace, so that might be one key piece of open source software that might appeal to the education sector. OpenOffice is another huge example. So a lot of us that are running Linux on our laptops and desktops, we almost exclusively use OpenOffice for our day-to-day work.
So how many people at HP are using Linux on the desktop?
That's a pretty tricky question. And I don't think I can give you an authoritative answer, but I would venture a guess that number is in the thousands of people. But that's probably.
And what version of Linux are they using?
Oh, it's kind of all over the place. But I would probably say that a lot of the people that have started using Linux on the desktop recently are using some flavor of Ubuntu or Debian. So HP, I'm not sure if you're totally familiar with this, but HP has a long history with the Debian community, and the open source and Linux organization, which is something that the open source program office is also a part of, also has a lot of Debian developers. So traditionally within our lab and our organization, there's a lot of Debian and Ubuntu users, but all over the company we have Red Hat users, Fedora users, and a lot of SUSE users as well.
Interesting. What about MySQL? Is it used actively at HP?
Yeah, there are quite a few projects and products that use MySQL. HP also has various partnerships. So one of the commercial offerings that HP has come up with recently is supported middleware stacks. So we also have MySQL, a partnership with MySQL where we provide supported services for MySQL. Postgres is also another database that we're seeing an increasing number of people within HP using. So.
And the HP thin client line, which I'm assuming much of which uses Linux on the actual thin clients, is HP using those thin clients internally? And if so, are you doing any Linux thin client or just Windows thin client?
So in terms of thin clients and internal usage, the uses that I've been aware of are still limited trials. So there are some fixed function factory worker type segments where we're starting to deploy some thin clients. I don't have all the details, but I can get those to you later if you want. But the newer versions of thin clients that we've started coming out that we're offering to our customers, there are actually quite a few of the models that are based off of Debian. Again, this strong connection between HP and Debian here.
And I know I'm asking you questions that's not really fair for you to have to represent all of HP. At the same time, I'm trying to bring some concrete examples because a lot of schools that will be listening don't have the more sophisticated computing structure, but they're going to be looking at Linux on the desktop, or they'll be looking at some simplified server-based solutions.
Sure.
But you've answered them well, and I appreciate it.
Sure, no problem at all.
Can you describe the difference between free software and open source software? What do you think that is?
Well, so that kind of becomes a philosophical question, and again, this is one of those things that different people are probably going to give you different answers. But if you look at the free software movement, I would probably say that it has its foundation in the FSF and the GNU and the Richard Stallman school of thought, which basically talks about the freedom of software, which means any user, when they receive a piece of software, they are able to do whatever they want to do with it. So there are different levels of freedoms that they talk about. So the freedom to run the program, for example, use it however they want, study how the program works. So, have access to the source code, look inside it, modify it, and give my friend a copy. So there are various types of freedoms that one can associate with software. So the free software movement is more inclined towards those aspects of the philosophical freedom that you can attach to software. The open source movement, if you will, is not too far off, but at the same time, I think it takes a different tack in the sense that one could even look at it as being maybe a practical version or a practical implementation. Not to say that the free software movement is not practical, but the open source movement is more towards, okay, do you have access to the source code? What can you do with the source code? And how do you make modifications to the source code? Is the source code available to you to do whatever you feel? And can you improve it? And can you release the improvements to the public and so on? So I think it's more of a philosophical difference between people that strongly believe that freedom as it applies to software is important, as opposed to others that say, okay, as long as it's open and it's based on open standards and it's an open implementation, then I'm okay using it, as opposed to being tied to a proprietary implementation. I think both of these are, if you put them against, if you put them on axis against proprietary software, both of them will fall in the same place. It's just different angles, different ways of looking at the same answer, if you will.
So what have you noticed, at least inside of a huge company like HP, what have you noticed in terms of perceptions of free and open source software or Linux? Has there been a change? Is there momentum? A year ago, if you said Linux, did you get a different look than if you say Linux now? What kind of changes are companies like HP going through?
So that's a good question. I think there is generally a lot of awareness within HP. We're also seeing a lot more people, especially the development community within HP, be more aware of the power and all the resources that are available in the free and open source community. But I also think increasingly you're seeing that there are lots of aspects of the free software movement that would apply even within an enterprise. So, for example, we talked about the informal, sharing and like meritocracies, people looking at each other's code. So there is a lot more of that kind of awareness happening within HP in the development community. From a cost perspective, there is also a lot more investigation going on into, how can we cut costs? Obviously, that's a good question that a lot of people are asking these days, and Linux and open source software have proven to be a good alternative when people are looking at cost-effective alternatives. And another aspect that people are also looking at is, okay, once we bring this in, how does this scale? So can free and open source software scale along the same levels as, say, some proprietary software that people might have been used to? So there's definitely a lot more awareness, I would say. And then this is traditionally, we see this increasing actually day by day. So
I think a lot of schools, maybe school districts and school boards, have some hesitancy about free and open source software because they're just not very familiar with it. And I think as corporate America begins to adopt free and open source software more and more widely in more and more ways, that's going to really help schools, because the increased awareness will make it less difficult for a school board or a superintendent to consider something that previously was unknown or very little known in the school environment.
So are the challenges mostly the lack of awareness, or the lack of, what are some of the key challenges that you're seeing today?
Well, I think there are two. I think one challenge is that the philosophical movements behind free and open source software have tended to put a lot of pressure on teachers and small decision makers at lower levels to convert to free software because of the philosophical or moral issues. And part of what I've been discovering in this interview series is that from the standpoint of an individual teacher, implementing Linux or free and open source software is really not any easier than implementing Windows and proprietary software. Teachers have very busy schedules. They have a lot that's going on. They're responsible for a lot of things besides introducing computers into their classroom. And at that level, putting Ubuntu or Linspire or SLED in front of a teacher is not really any easier for them. And so I think there's been a little bit of a misunderstanding in terms of the community as to how to approach the local schools, because from the standpoint of making it easy to transition, it's a big jump. I mean, it's just as hard for them to run Linux as it is to run Windows. In fact, maybe even harder because they don't have the background. Then as you go up the decision-making chain at schools, I think what we're discovering is that as you get to the district level and you get to more widespread decision-making, that number one, that there's a lot of financial interest involved, that the commercial or proprietary vendors are going to be very anxious to maintain their market share, and so there's money spent on shows and marketing and the like, and there's also a little bit of a lack of awareness because most schools have trained their technicians in proprietary software, and so again it involves a lot of sort of retooling. And where we're finding that free and open source software are making the best inroads are in programs that are really easily adopted. So Moodle has done a tremendous amount of good for the free and open source software movements in schools because it's so compellingly easy to use, and it's so much cheaper than the alternatives. OpenOffice, I think, is beginning to do that a little as well, where schools are using OpenOffice because they financially not have the funds to pay for licensing for a proprietary Office suite, and so they will use OpenOffice, and then they discover that it in fact accomplishes most of what they need to accomplish. So it's very interesting, and the interview series is attempting to explore this a little. So that's where we are right now, at least in terms of some basic understanding.
No, that's actually really interesting insight, because so one of my interests has been personally to just look at how open source software may be applicable to education and schools, but I tend to see it as two different camps almost. There's FOSS in education, and then there is FOSS as education. So FOSS in education seems to be closer to what you're describing, which is using free and open source software in education, like Moodle, like OpenOffice. Now, how about looking at, okay, when we are trying to educate our students, what aspects of the free and open source paradigm do we want to adopt? Do we want to encourage our kids to collaborate with each other? Do we want to encourage our kids to, use wikis and blogs? Because, a lot of people are really comfortable these days with open content and open data and whatnot. So that, to me, is more FOSS as education, because then you're taking aspects of the open source movement and applying that to education. So I think
that's a great point. It's a great point. And the one story I tell in that regard often enough that the listeners are going to be tired of hearing it again, is, if Apache runs 70% of the world's web servers, why is Apache virtually untaught in our schools?
Mm-hmm.
Python, PHP, and MySQL. There are tremendous tools available that don't require a huge investment in computing equipment,
mm-hmm.
and would allow a student who becomes familiar with these tools to be very productive without having to spend a lot of money after school,
mm-hmm.
and probably in a position to get a job very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But these things aren't being taught widely, and I think I think that may come back again to the commercial interests.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to an educational technology show, there's typically an exhibit hall, and it's an enormous expense
mm-hmm.
that these companies go to communicate to school the value of their programs.
Mm-hmm.
And the free and open source software movements don't have those funds to communicate in the same way. And the other thing that the free and open source software movements haven't had, and I think they really need, is they haven't had a champion in education.
Mm-hmm.
And in South Africa, you've got Mark Shuttleworth, who has had success using open source software in business, who's really championed open source software for education, and it's very visible and does a lot related to that. Part of what I'm hoping to see over the course of the next couple of years is companies like HP or Novell or Red Hat getting to a point where they really actively put some weight behind open source software in schools, not just in education, but as education.
Mm-hmm.
And I've loved how you phrased that, because, if you're a student in a low-income inner-city school, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to teach you how to use Photoshop.
Right.
But it could do you a heck of a lot of good to learn how to use GIMP,
mm-hmm.
or to learn the basics of networking and internet protocols, and to be able to build a database in MySQL and create a web page that pulls that data.
Exactly.
Those would be great skills, but there's really no champion for that yet.
So it's curious that you mentioned that, because so the FLOSS world being what it is, I'm curious as to why you think that we need someone like Mark Shuttleworth for the schools here. Why can we not use Mark Shuttleworth or the work that he's doing with Ubuntu as inspiration? And also another thing that you mentioned was the free and open source community is probably not going to some of these trade shows and whatnot. And are those the kinds of communication mediums that the education community looks for information from? Or where does the education community get this information from? Where do they go seeking this?
Well, I think they get it from publications,
mm-hmm.
And I think they get it from the shows. And we're doing some larger open source labs or pavilions at a number of the more prominent educational technology shows. And the support from those show organizers for open source has really been wonderful. And I think it's starting to make a difference, and I think it will continue to do so. There is sort of a growing movement, and I think it's we'll see some very nice things over the course of the next several years. At the same time, it's very different. I met with a sales rep from Novell 2 days ago,
mm-hmm.
and I can go to as a small company or as an individual, I can go to a local school and I can say, hey, let's take this these 60 old P2 computers and we can convert them to thin clients and run them in Linux. And here's what you can do with your students. You can teach them the following languages, and you'll have stable computing, and it's inexpensive. And that doesn't really get very far. But when Novell goes into the school
mm-hmm.
and says, hey, we can help you convert your old computers to thin clients, there's a higher level of listening.
Mm.
And so that's, it doesn't need to be Mark Shuttleworth necessarily, but if, I think what we need is some larger players to really step up to the plate and say, we're going to support open source in education, so that when Steve Hargadon goes to Dallas to speak about open source in education,
mm-hmm.
that it's sponsored by Novell or it's sponsored by HP. or that there are personnel there who sit on a panel and, like you, and talk about how HP is using open source software. And even just this interview, hopefully, is one more little brick in the wall, where you say, okay, HP is a well-respected company, and look at what HP is doing with open source software, and you can now use this information when you're thinking about the future, where you're going as a school or a district, to know that there is real value in learning about open source software.
Oh, absolutely. And I realize we may be getting a little, off track here, but I just wanted to give you one more example that I think you might find useful to maybe, research upon a little bit more. If you haven't guessed already, I come from India. There is a southern Indian state called Kerala. And
right.
If you've actually followed what's happening there, I think it's just absolutely fascinating, because when I was in school, a lot of the software that we were using was proprietary software. So we used, Turbo C++, Boolean C++, and then, the Microsoft Visual Studio and whatnot. But we really didn't have too much open source software being used in our schools. But with a state like Kerala and the government actually playing a huge active role, along with the Free Software Foundation's India chapter and a lot of volunteers there, what's happening in Kerala is just amazing. All the schools are now going to move to free and open source software as part of their curriculum, and they've actually established teacher training institutes all over the state, so the teachers that want to learn, so that they can then teach the students, they can go and get themselves trained. So that might actually be an example if you haven't been following, but it sounds like you have. And so,
well, I have, and actually I'm going to be interviewing Richard Stallman on Saturday, and I would imagine that will come up. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's a communist government, isn't it?
I think it's so. You're right.
It plays against our worst associations with open source software.
So the political party is, the Communist Party or whatnot, but they are not communists. It's the death by association type of mentality that I would think.
Yeah, I thought I sort of cringed at that, because I love the example, and I think in a lot of ways it's really significant, because it is a decision that, when it comes from that high level, has the power to communicate value. Mm-hmm. in a really strong way. And I think, Mike Huffman's doing the same thing in Indiana, mm-hmm. where their work with Linux in the schools, coming at that high level from the State Department of Education, really makes a difference. Mm-hmm. And we've sort of gone down an interesting road here. The positive news of this is I think we're hearing more and more about it. Mm-hmm. And I think, as we've talked about in other interviews, companies like Microsoft have a first mover advantage, which is, they have the ability to lower their price down to a point where somebody looking at open source software may choose to stick with, say, Microsoft Office. Mm-hmm. And, there are philosophical arguments with that, but the other great result of that is, whether someone goes with Microsoft Office or they go with OpenOffice, now all of a sudden your school is paying a significantly less money for those computing resources, and that's a real benefit.
Right.
Meaning, the moment that a school can reduce their budget for software by $200,000, a school district, all of a sudden that money can go towards a music program or mm-hmm. toward some other activity, and that's a real win. And I think that the benefits from the open source movement are not just going to be the adoption of open source software, but hopefully the reduction in costs for schools in providing computers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I was just thinking, as you said, and I think what you've outlined is probably maybe the need for a focus group or a special interest group, if you will, from the open source community, along with key players in the technology industry, to actually help understand what the requirements are for the education sector, so that they can start adopting and embracing open source software, and then help them to start doing that.
Well, good. So I want to give you an opportunity to get through your slideshow.
Sure.
But I'm really glad that we went down that road, and especially I'm glad that you defined floss in education and floss as education, because I've been talking about that for a long time, but not nearly in such a descriptive way.
I'm glad. Okay, and again, we don't have to necessarily go through all the slides, so I'll go through some of these slides. A lot of these are probably information that are familiar to you. Maybe these are things you've covered in the past, so if you come across things that, are probably not as pertinent, feel free to let me know, and I'll move on to the next thing. But I'm basically on slide number 7 now, which outlines some common reasons why individuals or companies use and contribute to open source software. So there's the quintessential, to scratch an itch, the Linus, I wanted to write a kernel, so I wrote Linux example. There are the philosophical reasons that we talked about, with the free software and the Free Software Foundation and whatnot. So there's also a lot of true altruism. So, for example, Tim Berners-Lee, who's widely credited as the father of the World Wide Web as we know it, could easily have patented all of his work, and he chose not to. And then, of course, there's also the competitive nature of humans. I don't know if you've been to this website, wikimatrix.org. So I was actually looking at doing an evaluation of various wiki softwares for some internal project purposes. And I said, okay, I need a comparison of DocuWiki and a couple of others. And then I came across this website, and there's about 70 to 80 implementations of wikis today. So
it's amazing.
It's totally unbelievable. And a lot of these wikis would probably benefit if the developers got together and said, you know what, I'm pretty much doing the same thing you're doing, but it's just, human nature, I think. So those are just some of the common reasons that one would hear as to why people, use or create open source software. With companies, a lot of the same reasons apply, and in addition to these, there's always the cost savings or the cost spreading, so that one company does not have to do all of the software development on what is going to be an industry standard, if you will. So a bunch of companies get together, manageability standards. It's a good example, so that companies can then spread their costs across different entities or whatnot. And then there's also the key, and I think this one applies to a lot of educational institutions as well, is the vendor or platform independence. So I wanted to give a quick example of how HP uses OpenLDAP as a directory server. Do you think your listeners are probably familiar with what an LDAP directory server does?
Well, let's assume that they are. And,
okay.
And if they're not, I'll put a link to an article where they can look it up.
Okay. So within HP, we have a huge enterprise directory infrastructure, and this serves, among other things, as being our chief authentication hub, so that anybody that logs into the internal company portal and wants to, say, look up someone's information, like a people finder type application, or even our instant messaging. I mentioned Jabber. Our instant messaging system is tied in to the enterprise directory so that people can authenticate using the same credentials. All of this, until some months back, was running on a proprietary piece of software that was severely preventing us from doing some of the things that we wanted to do. It did not give us the flexibility. We were being charged, exorbitant license prices, all the things that you would hear with proprietary software. So some time back, we started looking at, okay, are there any good open source alternatives? And we looked at OpenLDAP. And OpenLDAP, at that point, it didn't have a lot of the capabilities that we wanted. So we started working with a company called Simus, which employs Howard Chu. Now, Howard Chu is the chief architect of OpenLDAP. And so when HP and Simus started working together on OpenLDAP, we started putting a lot of code back into OpenLDAP to bring it up to a stage where now all of HP's mission-critical enterprise directory infrastructure is running on Linux machines powered by OpenLDAP. So I think that's a key example of how open source software is now being used and helps address the whole vendor and platform independence issue. Another common reason that companies use is also so we don't end up reinventing the proverbial wheel. So, for example, XML parsers. There are a lot of development teams that need XML parsers, and I cannot recall the last time a team actually wrote their own XML parser. I mean, there's libXML, there's Xerces, there's just so many really good XML parsers that are out there that it doesn't really make sense for you to go and reinvent the wheel. Moving on to slide 8, I just wanted to quickly provide an example of how open source software is being used, and we really see this usage being kind of the Lego or building blocks model, and I think it stems from the open source software and the free software movement foundations from the Unix world. So the Unix pipe, for example, allows you to put together various commands and then feed them to another command. So you basically get a bunch of independent programs. All of these programs do one thing really well, and then you put those together to create something new from all of the parts. And we have an example of something like that even within HP. So HP's IMAP proxy. So the IMAP proxy is actually a way for HP employees to get external access to their email. So a lot of HP employees are consultants, they're traveling on the road and they want access to their email. And within HP, we have a pretty complex mailing infrastructure as well. So there are a whole bunch of users that have Exchange servers, and then there are other IMAP servers and whatnot. So we wanted a standards-based mechanism to provide access to these road warriors or people that are traveling or whatnot. And we took some really good pieces of open source software. So there is an IMAP proxy server called Perdition, and then there is a web-based client called Squirrelmail. And then we put all of these together, and then PAM LDAP to do the authentication pieces. And what we created out of this was a solution that was standards-based, fully open source software, little to no cost from the perspective of software licenses, and we have a solution that actually helped solve a business problem. So this kind of usage, basically what it illustrates is that there's a huge shift going from just creating huge bulky pieces of software to shifting their focus towards gluing individual pieces of software together. So if you notice, a lot of the current day Web 2.0 mashups are essentially the same thing. You're gluing together different pieces of software together, and the free and open source software paradigm kind of enables that. Another thing that we've seen a lot of our customers actually use open source software for is to provide varied levels of service. So for example, if you have a database application and you have a high volume of read type transactions, but these are of low value. So, for example, say you're a stock company and you're a stock trading company. You have a lot of customers that want to read stock information on a regular basis, but from a monetary value to your company, that probably isn't too much happening when they're reading it. But when they want to bid and when they actually want to trade stock, then you're actually getting something. So what we're actually seeing some companies do is use open source software to provide these kinds of lower service levels, if you will. So the read transaction, as I said, if it fails, the user is more than likely going to hit refresh or try again sometime later. You don't want that right, or the transaction where they're going to pay you money. You don't want that to fail. So they're actually using open source software for some of these lower value transactions, if you will. So having said that, obviously there are numerous advantages to using open source software, but if we look at slide 9, I've tried to outline some of the common challenges that some of the companies place, and you can combine a lot of this under the topic of open source governance. So obviously you need a really good understanding of the various licenses, especially if you're producing proprietary software that includes open source software. You need to understand what those licenses mean when you're combining and how they interact, how the interaction is between open source and proprietary pieces of software. There is also the question of maturity. So there are lots of, we talked about 50, 60 wiki implementations out there. For an enterprise to deploy it, software maturity is a huge metric. How do you manage this? There are so many options that are out there, and when information technology or computers is not the core competency of your business, you probably want someone else to support it. So how supportable are some of these pieces of open source software? So these are all some of the common challenges that we're actually seeing today. So within HP, moving to slide 10, what we've done is we've tried to explain to a lot of our customers, a lot of our partners, and through opportunities like this to other people, we explain why companies need to manage open source software. There's a lot of usage going on that's pervasive, that's not always visible, how it's used, where it's used, who contributes to the community, and it's good to have a handle on all of these within an organization. Open source licenses, like I mentioned, need to be managed and understood. We track more than 180 unique licenses today, so there's a whole bunch of complexity that's there. I want to definitely outline that open source has a really compelling, value proposition, if you will. The lower TCO, the choice, the vendor neutrality, all of this is there. But I also want to reiterate the fact that having a central place within an organization that understands this and kind of serves as a resource for the rest of the organization, in HP's experience, has proved to be very valuable. So within HP, if you look at slide 11, some of the things that we do in managing our usage and contribution of open source is that we have clearly defined and communicated open source policies and guidelines for all of our engineers, for all of our managers, for business directors, so they all know what their roles and responsibilities are. We've developed a lot of internal open source training and awareness programs, and we also have an internal website, a central place where we inventory and track. I mentioned I work as part of the open source program office and the review process, so as part of this, we inventory and track all of the open source projects that we use, the code we use, or community contributions, what products ship with what open source software. And so we've essentially established a really good open source governance process within the company. And we've also established an internal open source community because we've seen the value of just using so many aspects, the collaboration, the meritocracy, the free sharing of the code reuse, that happens within the open source community. We've seen the value of that within an enterprise, within a corporate enterprise as well. So we've established a lot of these, and I think these are all some key learnings that I would really want to get out to the education community as well. Slide 12. Basically, this actually talks about some of the things we've already talked about. I talked about FOSS in education and FOSS as education. So I really think that using free and open source software methodologies in education helps students learn how to learn. The free content actually helps global reach of knowledge. MIT's open courseware is a great example. Any student, sitting in any corner of the world can now take these classes, and these are some amazing professors, top of the notch professors, from MIT that are putting their courses out there. I mean, this is unbelievable. So it creates a whole knowledge dissemination network, just like Wikipedia does, So I think there are so many aspects of free and open source software that I think directly apply to education. That and I really hope that a company like HP is able to help the education community use the potential and embrace and adopt open source software as much as possible. So with that, I'm going to. I don't know how we are doing on time, but I'm going to turn it back to you to see if there are any other questions or closing comments.
No, I think we're great on time. And I will tell you, I think you're the most prepared guest I've had on the show.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's going to be really fun to actually have a presentation up on the web that people can follow to go through this material. I've left this conversation, with a couple of insights. One, obviously your phrasing, plus in education, plus as education, describing and defining something that we've been talking about a lot, but haven't done as good a job of phrasing. And also, I think the examples of HP's actual use of open source software for its own internal use, the Open LDAP project, that's really compelling. And I think it does provide examples not only of people are going to look at HP as a commercial company and say, okay, HP will have an interest in communicating something to us in order to be able to sell us a service. Mm-hmm. But we can look at the example of, HP actually using open source software for their own business processes, and that's very compelling because that's not about selling a service to someone. That's about just recognizing the value for HP as a company and going down that path. And certainly that's going to apply more toward larger educational organizations that will contribute to certain software packages where the cost of that contribution is less than the commercial package would be, and they get the benefit of also contributing to the community as a whole. And that happens quite a bit with programs like Moodle. Then I think the whole question of how we help communicate to schools, both about FLOSS in education and FLOSS as education, that's a great open topic you've brought back to the center again, and I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback on as we keep moving forward here.
Excellent.
Ragavan, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the opportunity. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I actually downloaded a lot of the podcasts that you have there. I see you have some amazing people like John Mad Dog Hall, and you said you're going to be talking to Richard Stallman. So I really, really think the kind of work that you're doing is a huge service for the education sector, and I'm really thankful for you providing this opportunity to HP and me to be able to be a part of this conversation.
No, and thank you for being so prepared and doing such a good job in communicating.
You're more than welcome.